You're watching Sky News, and in just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. The King has praised the community spirit that he says has countered aggression and criminality after more than a week of unrest in parts of the country. Ukraine's made more territorial gains as its surprise incursion into Russia goes into a fourth day, with Russian attempts to repel the raid so far failing. More than 60 people have died after a plane crash in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making headlines with the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and the Associate Political Editor of the New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Guys, thanks very much for being with us. Let's take a look at what is on some of those front pages, and we'll start with The Times, which leads with King Charles praising Britain's community response to the riots. The headline for The Express shows the King calling for unity in the wake of what we've seen in the past week. The Telegraph also leads with the King's hopes that respect and understanding will unite the nation. The Mirror goes to the BBC demanding Hugh Edwards return the salary paid to him after his arrest. The Mail also leads with Mr Edwards being told to hand back his £200,000 salary. The headline for the Eye says that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, may be planning to increase fuel duty in her first budget. While The Guardian reports universities are facing bankruptcy as their funding runs out. And the Financial Times leads on the sale of the UK's largest investment platform, Hargreaves Lansdown. And a reminder, by scanning the QR code that you see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of the papers while you watch along with us. Now, tonight we're joined by Henry Hill and Rachel Cunliffe. As I said, Rachel, Henry, thanks both for being with us. Let's get straight into it, and we'll start with the front page of The Telegraph, Henry. And this is a statement from the King, which came across our wires just before 8 o'clock, calling for unity.
Yeah, this is, in a sense, it's a dog-bite man story. The King is calling for unity. It would be very remarkable if the King did anything else. But it is what the monarchy is for, and in fairness, it's what it's best at. It's one of the advantages of having a non-partisan institution, because I think we've seen, and I think we'll touch on maybe later in response to the riots, anger at government ministers, things polarising along party lines, and having a figure like the King, who is completely above all that, who can speak to what is best in this country, is hugely important. Now, hopefully, what we're going to see after this, the riots do seem to have been, fingers crossed, touch wood, petering out. The law and order response has been good, so hopefully we're turning a corner. And I hope that anyone out there who might have been tempted to cause trouble, who considers themselves to be a patriot, this is the King. He's telling you to stay at home. Do what he says.
And Rachel, what have you made of the fact that, we have heard from the palace in the past sort of few days that the King's been kept informed? As part of this statement, it said that he had a call with the Prime Minister as well as the head of the police chiefs as well, and the Gold Commander of the UK. The sense that the King wants to kind of feel like he is fully abreast of what's happening.
Given everything that Henry just said about this being part of the role of the monarchy, I am somewhat surprised that we haven't had some kind of intervention or address like this previously earlier on in the violence that we've seen. Now, we know that the King's health is a factor. We know that he's undergoing cancer treatment. But I think if what you're trying to do is send a message that the violence that we've seen on our streets doesn't represent Britain and doesn't represent British values and patriotism, then having an intervention from the monarchy is powerful in that way. So I think it's interesting that it's only come at this point after they have started to peter out. I also think it's interesting that we haven't had so much that kind of national address from the Prime Minister either about sort of bringing people together. We have had a lot about law and order, facing the full consequences, the Prime Minister and the government's support of the emergency services, and rightly so. But we haven't had that kind of narrative yet about what this means and how it doesn't represent our country. I think it's interesting that it's coming from the King rather than the government.
Thought on that, Henry, about the sort of the unifying message and whether or not it should have come sooner?
I mean, arguably, yes. I don't want to second-guess the people who advised the King on this decision, but yeah, I think Rachel has a very good point in that the King is a resource, and deploying him late is obviously worse. The stuff about the government, I think, is more interesting because normally when we have public disorder, there is a call for everyone to come back together. But I think it is important that the government is saying that actually, we're not coming together with the far right. This is not a question of kumbaya, let's sit down and hear what they have to say. What are their legitimate reasons for sort of burning down police stations and attacking asylum seeker hotels, right? This is a law and order question first and foremost, and I think it's being treated appropriately.
Yeah, and the King had said in that statement that he does at some point, when circumstances allow, wants to carry out a visit where he'll get to sort of see for himself how communities have come back together. Let's take a look at this story in the Times. This kind of speaks a little bit to what you were saying there. And again, it's this term that has been used by some politicians this week, and this comes from Priti Patel, who's a candidate to be a Conservative leader, talking about the fear of two-tier policing, damaging public trust. Tell us about this reporting, Henry.
Yeah, so this is Priti Patel, as you say, is running for leadership, former Home Secretary in the last Conservative government, and she's voicing the concern that the very muscular response that we have seen, far less muscular than the British public would like, according to opinion polling, but nonetheless, the very muscular response that we've seen to these riots from the police contrasts with the way that they handle some other demonstrations. I think the contrast is often involved with Hare Hills, the riot the couple of weeks before, where actually what the police did was they sort of fenced it off and then they let it burn out. And that is actually standard police procedure, is that you don't go in with truncheons unless you absolutely have to and there's a threat to life and you make arrests afterwards. But it is something I think Starmer needs to address, because as a kind of hardline law and order Conservative, I think his response to the current riots is absolutely fantastic. Of course you should be going in and arresting them, but it is toxic in the long run because the police have to command respect across the board. And one of Peel's principles of policing is that the police have to be seen to be acting without fear or favour. And so if there is a perception, even if it's unfair, that they are handling different protests and different riots differently, that has to be addressed.
I suppose the question is, though, Rachel, how, other than saying it, as we heard from police leaders today, that there is no such thing, how can they actually address that?
Well, I think the point is made by Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, that if you are arguing that certain groups are treated differently by police, it's very unusual in normal circumstances to argue that the police are somehow softer on ethnic minority communities. We've seen in the past the exact opposite, and that's why, particularly in some parts of London, there were very tense relationships between certain communities and the police because of that perceived bias the other way. I think it's really interesting that this is coming from Priti Patel, because a week ago she was saying the exact opposite. She was asked this question about perceptions of two-tier policing and the way protests in the past had been policed, and she came out very, very strongly against what Nigel Farage had been saying, very, very strongly against criticisms of how the Black Lives Matter protests were policed during COVID, and essentially said that the raising questions on this and sort of calling the police into question, that was absolutely not the right time and place for it. And she's changed her tune on it somewhat, and now she's saying, she says, we don't know the facts about what happened in Birmingham, which is one of the examples given, but she goes, we just have to ask questions, and I think that speaks to the Conservative leadership contest.
That was going to be my point, Henry. Is she sort of recalibrating to speak to the
This speaks to the challenge. I think one of the big actual challenges to Priti Patel's leadership ambitions is that she was Home Secretary. She was also Home Secretary when Boris Johnson used the post-Brexit immigration system to massively ramp up net immigration, which is a challenge if she's running from the right. But what Rachel has just outlined is the problem of Priti Patel does not want her record as Home Secretary criticised. So all of the policing that happened when the Conservatives were in office, that must have been fine. Now, actually, as someone who wrote about it at the time, I think there were fairly tangible differences between the way anti-lockdown protests and BLM protests were policed. But she can't admit that because the Conservatives were in office. But now that Labour are in office, all of a sudden, it's on the table. And I think that's the kind of thing voters see through straight away.
Yeah, and that's why she says that it's damaging to the public trust. All right, let's move on from that story and move on to this on the front of the Mirror, got here. And this is the situation that the BBC are facing with Hugh Edwards. Henry?
Yeah, they want him to give back 200 grand that they paid him between his being suspended from work or arrested. I can't remember.
It was arrest and then quitting.
And then resigning. They have no ability to compel him to do this, and that is entirely right, because we would not want a system where an employer could force you to just claw back your money. But it obviously puts the BBC in a hugely awkward position that they allowed him to be paid that much money while this process was going on.
I mean, they had to ask, I guess, for the money back, didn't they, Rachel?
I'm kind of with Henry this. I think that if you've been paid money according to your contract, your employer's ability to claw it back afterwards, I think that would be quite an unusual thing to have written into your employment contract. I also think because of the charges that he has admitted to and the sort of level, rightly, of emotion around this case, we can get a bit carried away here. He was continued to be paid after he'd been arrested, but not after he hadn't been charged at that point, and he certainly hadn't pled guilty. So if you're thinking about this in a workplace management situation and you have an employee who's been arrested for something, but you don't know yet whether they're going to be found guilty, whether they're going to be convicted of that, I think you're in quite a complex area of employment law if you suspend them without pay. And I think if it had turned out that he hadn't pled guilty and it had gone in another direction, they would be facing an employment tribunal case for their response then. So I think the BBC is in a position where nothing it could have done at that particular moment was the right thing, and I think we're possibly getting carried away just because of how vast the figures are, which takes us to a wider conversation of should BBC presenters be paid so much in the first place? Definitely, let's have that conversation, but that shouldn't be purely based on this particular incident.
I mean, the chairman, Samir Shah, said that he acted in bad faith by taking the money when he knew what had happened. I mean, I guess that is what you would say at that point, isn't it? And as you rightly point out, it's very difficult once the contract is there to then try to claw it back.
Yeah, I think the point is that hard cases nearly always make bad law, and bad people deserve due process because otherwise we don't have due process. So it is perfectly reasonable that somebody who has been arrested but not charged and not convicted has the same legal protections as everyone else, and that includes the right to the salary their employer has chosen to pay them. The BBC could have taken a risk, right? Yeah. They could have suspended him without pay, and they could have risked that backlash. They chose not to do that. And as a result, they are where they are. But I think, would it be nice if he handed it back? Of course it would. Will he? No.
Will he give it back, Rachel? What do you think?
I doubt it. I mean, it's not like his reputation is going to be salvaged from giving it back, so why would he?
All right, move on.
Yeah.
FT, and this is the situation that we're seeing in Kursk. It's been now a few days that the Ukrainians have launched what the reports suggest is the biggest incursion into Russia since the Second World War.
Of course, in the Second World War, Russia included Ukraine. So the geography is... Reading about the Battle of Kursk as a World War II person, it's just like, ooh.
That's the biggest tank battle of the war, right?
Absolutely. When the Germans saying that they'll let Ukraine use their tanks, and it's like, you want to settle a score, do you? This, on the one hand, it's really nice to see Ukraine getting some advances. They have been under pressure in the eastern Ukraine on the Donbass front for months now. Day after day after day, if you follow it, you see Russian troops making small advances, and that all adds up. That's thousands and thousands of young men injured or crippled or dead. So they basically launched a new front to try and distract Russian forces away from there and put political pressure on Putin. The question is whether or not it will work, because Putin is a dictator, and so there's not all that many avenues for the Russian people to be like, actually, we don't want this war anymore. And if it doesn't work, they are going to have committed a lot of people on a completely new front without entrenchments, and they're going to have drawn elite forces away from the front that they actually have to defend in eastern Ukraine. So, historically, stuff like this, it's a bit sort of Battle of the Bulgy, it cannot pan out. But it is very nice to see them advancing, and I wish them the best.
Nice to see is the word you used as well. And the interesting thing to me about all of this is that it's being reported in all the Russian media, all the sort of state newspapers about this incursion. And I wonder whether that sort of speaks to this narrative that Putin had, that, the homeland is under threat, and this kind of reinforces that. Well,
it's a matter of national pride as well. Like when Putin launched this war, it was supposed to be over in 2 weeks, and it was supposed to be about gaining ground in Ukraine. And for Russia itself to be attacked, there's a sort of deep emotional aspect to that. The timing of this, though, I wonder, Ukraine and the whole Western world is looking very closely at America. They're looking at the American election. They're looking at the prospect of a second Trump term, the US withdrawing from NATO or certainly giving NATO fewer resources. I wonder if there is a sense with Ukraine that it's very possible that time is running out, or certainly the support they've got from the rest of the world is running out. They've kind of got until November. After November, who knows what's going to happen.
So they're not sure what they can do at this stage. All right, Rachel, Henry, for now, thanks very much for that. Plenty more to come of tomorrow's front pages, including this from the front of The Guardian. They're reporting universities are facing bankruptcy as some of their funding runs out. We'll talk about that next.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours, and we're going to take it back.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power. Now, freedom! There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition. We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes, torrential rain and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued with its ultimatum to the people of Ashkelon, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in. Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous. We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. A first look at what's on some of the front pages of tomorrow morning's newspapers with me, Henry Hill and Rachel Cunliffe. Guys, let's crack straight on. We've got a few minutes left. Let's look at this story on the front page of The Guardian, one that really jumped out at me, Henry, actually, thinking about the idea that universities could be going to the walls. They're running out of money.
Yeah. Universities have basically got caught in a vice. Because tuition fees are frozen, they now, according to research from the Russell Group of sort of the 20 universities, lose money on pretty much every domestic pupil. Vastly more on medics and STEM than humanities, but they don't even make money on your history students now. Mm-hmm. We had been papering over that by allowing them to take vast numbers of international students and allowing those international students to bring over dependents and everything else. The Conservatives cracked down on that, and now we're reaching the point where some of these institutions might potentially go under. Labour have ruled out a big bailout, and so what we're looking at instead, apparently, is mergers. And that is a terrible idea because it means taking a bad, unreformed institution that's losing money, taking a good research university, and just like making it responsible for diverting funds into a struggling institution.
And, of course, I guess it would be the students eventually that would lose out in this kind of situation.
The students that would lose out, also the academics that would lose out. We know that there are academic jobs being lost all the time, so there are more people who are very, very highly qualified for those roles, but fewer of those jobs around. We know also that universities are on the, shall we say, the not good list of Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, who drew up this list before the election of crises that were going to have to be dealt with immediately. Prisons was on there, councils going bankrupt were on there, and universities going bust was on there, because we haven't seen that. And universities are one of Britain's greatest exports. They're something that has a lot of international cachet, lots of international students, as Henry said, who subsidise the domestic students. But financially, it doesn't work because the students are paying really too high fees at too high interest, but still those fees aren't enough to cover the obligations of the universities. And we just have no benchmark for what would happen if a university went under.
No, but it's worth pointing out as well, these are English universities. This situation's not going to happen in Scotland, is it?
Well, in Scotland, universities are fully funded for everyone, but I think Scottish universities have their own issues.
Namely that many more Scottish pupils struggle to get places there at all because they have every incentive to offer places to English, Welsh, Northern Irish, who count as international for some reason. And precisely. So if you look at clearing between...
So is it the economics of this that's led us to this point that universities, run as businesses, and it's a way of... And that's students are eventually suffering?
Yeah, but the problem with this is no one can decide what university's for, right? Like, are they for research excellence? Are they an extra 3 years of school, which is sort of the position if you're sending more than half of people there? How do we fund them? We fund them by allowing 18-year-olds to just pick a degree anywhere they like, and then the taxpayer stumps up the cash up front, and then they pay it back if they can. So decades of being completely unserious about this have led to wild overexpansion. Universities have ended up in a bidding war to get as many pupils through as possible, and this is where we've ended up. Government has to take some very hard decisions about how to fund higher education, and that will probably involve some places closing. And if they do useful things like, they are a way of getting regional subsidies into towns that otherwise don't have very much, find other ways of doing that without doing it through
there's a quote here from the Vice-Chancellor of East Anglia University saying, quite frankly, I don't think there are enough students to go around. That kind of shows that something's gone very wrong with the market economic model of this.
Feels a bit 2007, doesn't it?
Which is very weird. All right, let's try and finish with something to smile about. Let's talk about the Olympics, if we can. It's been a great Games. I've really enjoyed it. Haven't we all?
It's been
Team
wonderful.
GB have done very well, and Katarina Johnson-Thompson finally got a medal.
I've learnt so much about so many sports that I didn't even realise were sports. My favourite, I didn't know that was an Olympic sport currently, rhythmic gymnastics. Huge fan of that. Skateboarding, pure joy. Katarina Johnson-Thompson obviously got the silver medal, her first Olympic medal. I was watching her last night, absolutely phenomenal. She had a particularly good shot put throw, I think it was, that was like just a personal best. But the one that has really stood out to me is today's gold medal in rock climbing by a 19-year-old who...
There he is, Toby.
Oh, Toby Roberts. Just look at him. He's hanging by one finger off a 45-degree angled wall, off a hole that is like, I couldn't even fit my... And it's absolutely incredible. And there's always a bit of controversy when new sports get added to the Olympics, but I genuinely believe that rock climbing, both the lead climbing and the speed climbing, where they literally just fly up the wall, are some of the best spectator sports I have ever seen. So
it has been a great Games. I really enjoyed watching it, and I guess the time zone really helps. But, I mean, Henry, there has been controversy, hasn't there? I mean, it's not just about the new sports being added. We've had the controversy all around the boxing and other things as well.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, we're not going to have nearly enough time to go into the details of that controversy, but as somebody who does combat sports in a sort of amateur recreational way, that was a real example of something which is a genuine problem, which is people with X and Y chromosomes that don't necessarily present properly, which is a thing that sporting bodies have to deal with, that just got sucked into the culture war. Because they were like, oh, they're having the row about if it was trans. And it's like, she's not trans. Like, it was hugely frustrating.
Henry, Rachel, thanks both for that. Plenty more from you in the next hour of the programme. Stay with us.